Seine River. Spring 845. 111 men hanging from ropes, swaying in the wind like meat in a butcher shop. Frankish soldiers captured, hanged one by one. Their bodies form a curtain of death, visible from both banks of the river. The smell of urine and feces mixes with the heavy odor of filthy water. Crows are already landing on the shoulders of the dead, and in the center of the island, a tall man, hair soaked in blood and sweat, watches his own handiwork in silence. Ragnar Lothbrok does not smile. He just breathes, like someone who has just fed a starving god. This story is a narrative reconstruction based on medieval chronicles, Norse sagas, and the fear recorded by Ragnar's enemies, not a modern report. They say Ragnar was a hero, a visionary, a Viking king who defied the unknown and conquered glory. The TV series showed you a philosophical, charismatic, almost noble warrior, but that is the version you wanted to believe. The true memory of Ragnar, the one Frankish chroniclers wrote down with trembling hands, and which Norse sagas tried to romanticize centuries later, is much dirtier, much colder, and infinitely more brutal. This isn't the Ragnar of heroic battles. This is the Ragnar of the lost years, of the raids no one wanted to film, of the massacres TV was afraid to show. Because what the Franks feared between 840 and 860 AD wasn't conquest, it was terror, burning, hanging, enslaving. He turned fear into currency, violence into strategy, and human sacrifice into war propaganda. Why 111 men? Why hang prisoners in plain sight of an entire army? And what did Ragnar find in Paris that made a Frankish king collapse, weeping before a pagan? These questions echo in the chronicles, and they reveal a man who, for the Christians of the time, wasn't a legend. He was a calculation. Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't the first Viking to invade England or France, but for the chroniclers, he was the first to transform ritualistic terror into a military tactic. He didn't win because he was the strongest. He won because he understood something his Christian enemies never expected, that the fear of a Norse god could paralyze entire kingdoms. But to understand how a farmer from Denmark became the living symbol of the European nightmare, we must go back, not to the curious young man building a boat, not to the charismatic warrior uniting a band. We must go back to the forgotten years, those years between the first raid and the fame, the years when Ragnar stopped being human and learned to be a monster. Ragnar was born somewhere in Denmark or southern Sweden around 795 AD, in a world where childhood virtually didn't exist. By age 6, a Norse child already knew how to clean fish blood, hold an oar, and recognize the smell of a storm in the air. By 10, they learned to kill, not for sport, for survival. His father, the sagas say it was Sigurd Ring, a minor king, died when Ragnar was still young. He grew up in a dark wooden hall where men drank mead from horns and told stories of failed raids, of jarls who died drowned or betrayed. The lesson was clear. The Norse world rewarded strength, cunning, and cruelty. Everything else was weakness, and weakness was death. But Ragnar wasn't like the others. He was smaller, leaner. The sagas disguise this with metaphors about hairy breeches and dragons, but historical memory suggests Ragnar compensated for a frail body with something far more dangerous, a mind that never stopped calculating. While other young Vikings trained with axes, Ragnar studied patterns, tides, roots, fears. He observed how Christians prayed before dying, how they knelt, how they begged to an invisible god. And he understood something fundamental. Religion wasn't faith. It was organized fear. If Christians feared hell, the Vikings could become that living hell. The first test came early, a land dispute. An older, stronger man challenged young Ragnar publicly. Instead of accepting the duel, Ragnar waited. 3 days later, the rival turned up dead in a barn, drowned in a barrel of ale. No one proved anything, but everyone understood. Ragnar didn't fight like a warrior. He fought like a serpent. And that night, in the shadow of a burnt boat on a freezing beach, Ragnar made an oath no one heard. An oath that he would make the Christian world pay in bodies for the fear they tried to impose on the Norse people. That oath was not yet paid. By his 20s, Ragnar already commanded a small band, not by inheritance, by fear and admiration. He didn't promise glory, he promised promised gold, and he delivered. His first raids were small, coastal villages in Frisia, isolated monasteries in Northumbria, places where monks slept unarmed and vaults were locked only with wood. Easy. But Ragnar never settled for easy. In 841, something changed. Ragnar disappeared for months. When he returned, he brought maps. Not Viking maps, Christian maps, stolen from a monastery, likely in England. Maps showing rivers, cities, palaces, and among them, a name written in Latin that Ragnar couldn't read, but had a prisoner monk translate before killing him. Paris, the capital of the Franks, protected by armies, walls, and papal blessing. Unattainable, suicidal. Ragnar looked at the map, then at his men, and said something no one expected. "We aren't going to attack Paris. We're going to make Paris pay us not to attack it." It was a genius plan, or an act of suicidal madness. But what Ragnar was about to do in the following years, before even reaching Paris, was something no Christian chronicler could describe without trembling. Between 842 and 844, Ragnar vanishes from major official records. But monasteries in Ireland, Scotland, and the Frankish coast begin reporting something new, something worse. Not just raids, rituals. A monastery in Cork, monks found not just dead, but arranged in circles, heads facing north, blood drained into wooden bowls, runic symbols carved into stone walls, with knives still hot. The survivors, few, spoke of a tall, lean Viking leader who didn't shout orders. He just watched, like someone testing a recipe. Ragnar wasn't looting, he was experimenting. He had realized something that would change Viking warfare. Christians didn't fear death, they feared damnation. And if you could convince them that your gods were real and hungry, they would surrender before even fighting. He began using prisoners as living messages. He would release one, just one, always the most religious, always the most terrified. And this man would return to his city, carrying stories of sacrifices to Odin, of Vikings who drank blood, of warriors who felt no pain because they were already dead. Terror, propaganda, brutality as theater. And it worked. Entire villages surrendered upon seeing Ragnar's ships, not because he had more men, but because they believed he wasn't human. If this story is making you uncomfortable, it's because it's working. Fear was Ragnar's weapon, and remembering it today is disturbing too. If this type of raw historical narrative needs to keep existing, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like this shouldn't be forgotten. The ships were the other weapon. Ragnar perfected the langskip, the longship, shallow draft, capable of going up rivers where Frankish ships couldn't. Sails of wool dyed dark red, almost black, looking like bloodstains on the horizon. Prows carved with dragon and wolf heads, covered in tar and ash. At night, from a distance, they looked like living creatures emerging from the mist. Every detail was calculated, every symbol intentional. Ragnar wasn't building a fleet, he was building a religion of fear. In 844, he led a raid on the Loire River. 30 ships, 600 men. The target, Nantes, market day, hundreds of unarmed civilians. The garrison barely had time to react. Ragnar didn't besiege the city. He entered like a flood. The massacre lasted less than 2 hours. But what came next defined Ragnar. He didn't burn everything. He didn't kill everyone. Instead, he gathered the survivors in the square and chose one in every 10 to die by lot. The others were released with a single order: tell them what you saw and say, "We will return." It wasn't random cruelty, it was systemic cruelty. Ragnar understood that killing everyone generated revolt. Killing some and freeing the rest to spread terror generated surrender. If you want to understand how a mind like this works, stay with me, because what comes next isn't legend. It's the moment Ragnar stopped being a band leader and became the nightmare that would make a Christian emperor tremble. March 845. The Seine. 120 Viking ships ascend the river in tight formation. The dark water reflects sails red as diluted blood. On the banks, Frankish peasants drop tools and run, not to grab weapons, to pray. Ragnar is at the prow of the lead ship. Reinforced leather, short sword, long-handled axe. At his feet, bound, a Frankish captain captured weeks earlier in Rouen. Ragnar keeps him alive not for mercy, but for utility. This man knows the defenses of Paris, and Ragnar has already broken him more than once, with questions whispered in the dark. The fleet advances slowly. Every hour on the river is an hour of rising panic in Paris. Every village he doesn't attack is a message. We don't want you. We want the capital. Charles the Bald, King of West Francia, receives the news. 120 ships, 5,000 Vikings. Ragnar Lothbrok, he has an army. He has walls. He has gods God's blessing, but he has fear, because the stories from Nantes, from Cork, from the Loire don't speak of battles. They speak of rituals, of hangings, of bodies dangling from trees. Charles divides the army in two, 7,000 men on each bank of the Seine. The idea is to crush the Vikings in the middle. Ragnar sees the formation and understands immediately. It is exactly what he wanted. Easter Sunday. Ragnar doesn't attack Paris. He attacks the smaller army on the left bank. The assault is brutal and fast. The Franks form a shield wall, but the Vikings don't try to break through. They surround. They land behind Frankish lines. Axes break legs before shields. The sound is metal, screams, snapping bone. In less than 3 hours, the left bank army collapses. Men try to flee into the river. They drown. They are pulled onto ships. Ragnar gives an order. 111, only 111. 111 prisoners are separated. The rest are killed or dispersed. On the other side, the larger army watches. It doesn't move. Charles gives no order to cross. He saw the massacre. He saw the speed. He saw that Ragnar fights like someone who has already won, and he trembles. Ragnar sets up camp on an island in the middle of the Seine, in plain view of Paris and the Frankish army. And then he builds a tree. Not a real tree, but a tall wooden structure with horizontal beams. On it, he hangs the 111 prisoners, one by one, ropes around necks, slowly, while the Frankish army watches from the opposite bank, powerless. It's not just execution, it's sacrifice. Ragnar offers these lives to Odin and makes theater of it. Each swaying body is a sentence. Your god cannot save them. Mine is hungry. Why 111? Maybe a symbolic number. Maybe ancient revenge, but above all, it was large enough to terrorize, small enough not to waste slave labor. He wanted Charles to count. The tree of bodies remains visible for days. The smell takes over the river. Crows cover the island. Paris stops. Churches fill up. Prayers turn into screams. Soldiers desert, because what Ragnar hung there weren't just men. It was the illusion of divine protection. Charles sends emissaries. Ragnar receives them sitting on a makeshift throne of oars and Frankish shields. They offer 1,000 pounds of silver. Ragnar refuses. He wants 7,000. They say it's impossible. Ragnar walks to the bank, points to the tree, and sends a message. Then bring more men. I have space. Charles caves. 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, the largest ransom ever paid in Europe up to that time. Ragnar accepts, loads the ships. Before leaving, he burns the tree of bodies, with the bodies still hanging. Black smoke rises. The smell of burning flesh mixes with the incense of Paris churches, and Ragnar sails back down the Seine to the north. As the man who made a Christian empire pay not to be destroyed, but something broke inside. On the island, while hanging the last man, Ragnar saw in his eyes not hate, not fear, but pity. The soldier murmured in Latin, "You are already dead. You just don't know it yet." Ragnar had him hanged, but the phrase stuck. He returned rich, famous, feared, but he drank more, slept less, started seeing faces, heard names of the dead. The raids continued. The Mediterranean, North Africa, Christian and Muslim targets all mixed together, but the internal rhythm changed. For the first time, Ragnar hesitated before killing. Around 865, old for a Viking warrior, he decided to make one last raid on Northumbria. Not for gold, to prove to himself he was still the monster Paris feared. He left with few ships, an unforgivable tactical error. The storm did the rest. He was captured by King Ella, one of the Christians he had humiliated. Ella didn't want a ransom. He wanted revenge. He threw Ragnar into a pit of venomous snakes. The chronicles say he died slowly, singing of his deeds, his sons, Valhalla. His final phrase, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. He was speaking of his sons, and he was right. The news crossed the sea. His sons gathered the great heathen army, the largest Viking force England ever saw. They invaded in 865, captured Ella, and executed him with the blood eagle. Ribs opened from the back, lungs pulled out like wings. Historians debate if this was real or exaggeration, but Ragnar's sons wanted the world to believe it, just as their father had taught. Terror as theater. Today, Ragnar is a hero of TV shows, video games, t-shirts, a visionary, explorer, almost a martyr for Norse freedom. But the Frankish chroniclers, who saw the tree of bodies on the Seine, wrote something else. Perhaps Ragnar Lothbrok never existed as a single man. Perhaps he is the name Christians gave to fear. But what is undeniable is that someone in 845 made Paris pay, and the world never forgot. Ragnar wasn't the strongest Viking. He was the most efficient at transforming humanity into a disposable tool. He proved that fear, ritualized and staged, is worth more than 1,000 swords, and that an entire empire can be brought to its knees if you know exactly how many bodies to hang to break a king. The series sold you a complex hero. History delivers a brilliant and brutal strategist who paid for his own genius with his sanity. The lost years, those decades of bloody raids, rituals, and experiments in terror, were the period when Ragnar stopped asking, "Can I do this?" and started asking, "What happens if I do?" The answer was simple. Paris paid, Europe trembled, and Ragnar died alone in a hole full of snakes, singing to the past, because the present had nothing left to offer. If you want to dive deeper into the minds of men who changed history with calculated violence and staged fear, subscribe, because real monsters never wore capes. They used strategy, and they knew exactly how many bodies were needed to break a kingdom.